In this video, we're going to study Chapter 5 of Book 1 in Aristotle's Ethics. Thus far in our study, Aristotle has introduced us to the question of what the supreme good is, which men are to seek in their life. He led us to the answer to that question in Chapter 4, which is felicity or happiness, that happiness is the chief or supreme good at which all things aim, or to which all things aspire. And he explained to us that the controversy arises of what exactly felicity is. And I mentioned a little bit about the fact that our Lord provided us with an answer to that controversial question in the Gospel of St. Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, through the Beatitudes. One issue that he raised, Aristotle that is, one issue that Aristotle raised in Chapter 4 was that different groups of people tend to have different opinions about happiness because they judge it relative to their own condition and so on, relative to their own knowledge and experience. And therefore the vulgar or the common people tend to disagree with the learned on what happiness is. In Chapter 5, which is a very, very helpful chapter, very influential in the lives of students, I often find, Aristotle gets into this question of what different groups think of happiness and why they think of it differently as they do. So we're going to study Chapter 5 together, and without wasting any more time, let's get right to it. Chapter 5 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics. Aristotle says, "Let us, however, return from whence we have digressed," getting into that discussion of how the supreme good is to be investigated and what Plato thinks and what the different methods of investigation are. Aristotle says, I need to back up now. This is not the appropriate place for that discussion. Let's get back to the topic. It seems that men do not unreasonably form an opinion of good and felicity from the different kinds of lives that they live. In other words, the disagreement among men about what felicity is really isn't unreasonable. It actually makes sense. We can understand why men would have different definitions of happiness based on the different kinds of lives that men in the world live. And he's going to go and discuss these different kinds of lives here in Chapter 5. He begins and says, the vulgar, and the word vulgar just means common, the vulgar indeed, and the most worthless part of mankind, place felicity in pleasure. The vulgar, which represents most men, believes that happiness consists in pleasure. And on this account, they embrace the life which consists in the enjoyment of pleasure. For there are three kinds of lives which especially take the lead. The one we have just mentioned, that is the life of the vulgar or common people, the life lived by most human beings. Second, the political life. And third, the contemplative life. So Aristotle identifies three kinds of lives into which men can be categorized. The most popular is the vulgar, the common life. And again, the word vulgar just means common, but it's common for most people to believe that happiness consists in pleasure. The second kind of life he mentions is the political life, and the third, the contemplative life. And he's going to now, in Chapter 5, describe these in more detail. The multitude, therefore, appear to be perfectly servile, deliberately choosing the life of cattle. And they support their opinion when asked why they live that way, why they choose to live and pursue pleasure as if they're just animals. They support their opinion by pointing to the example of many persons in power who have preferred a voluptuous life. That's interesting. So the common people who don't have wealth, don't have power, don't have access to education, they're just common people. They look up at the wealthiest and most powerful people and see how they're living, and they see them immorally pursuing carnal pleasures. And the poor and the common, the vulgar, then conclude that must be happiness. And so they accept pleasure as the definition of happiness and pursue pleasure in their lives, imagining that when they experience pleasure, they're enjoying the good life. But it's interesting to see that Aristotle explains that they think that way because of the example of the powerful. But men of elegant minds, he said, men of elegant minds, more refined men, those who are addicted to practical concerns, place felicity in honor, not pleasure, but honor. This is nearly the end of the political life. So the second kind of life he mentions is the political life. And they define happiness as the attainment of honor. They're more elegant in mind than the vulgar because they seek something more than pleasure. They're willing to suffer, for example. They're willing to sacrifice. They're willing to pursue something that's more noble than mere carnal desires or the pursuits of cattle. They believe that honor is felicity. This, however, this pursuit of honor, appears to be more superficial or inferior than the good which is the object of our investigation in this study. For honor seems to be rather in the persons that give the honor, rather than in the one who is honored. But we prophesy that good is something appropriate, and of which it is difficult to deprive its possessor. Honor is so uncertain. The public opinion can change at any moment. You can enter into the favor of someone and fall out of their favor without even doing anything. And therefore it appears that honor is to be valued in the person who gives honor, not in the person who is honored, because the person who is honored can have that honor taken away. And therefore it can't be the ultimate good, because the ultimate good should be something that can't be taken away from its possessor. Farther still, it seems that men pursue honor in order that they may believe themselves to be worthy persons. They seek therefore to be honored by wise men and by those to whom they are known, and with a view to virtue. It is evident therefore that according to these men, virtue is more excellent than honor. Perhaps, however, someone may apprehend that this, namely virtue, is rather the end of the political life. But even this, even if we consider whether virtue is the end of the political life, even this would be more imperfect than the chief good ought to be. For it appears to be possible that he who possesses virtue, or he who is called virtuous, may sleep, or be unemployed through the whole of his life, and besides this may be afflicted with evils, and experience the greatest misfortunes. But no one would proclaim a man thus living to be happy, unless for the purpose of defending his position. And concerning these things indeed enough, for we have spoken sufficiently about them in our miscellaneous writings. But the third kind of life is the contemplative life, which we shall make the object of our consideration hereafter. The third kind of life is the contemplative life. And Aristotle said, this is the life that we're going to consider and investigate in the study of classical ethics. The life of the vulgar, we're not going to pay any attention to their definition of happiness, because if that's happiness, then cattle and slaves would be called happy. The pursuit of pleasure is not happiness. We might look at the political men and say the honor that's attained by political men, by famous soldiers and generals and politicians, great leaders, the honor that they receive is true happiness. No, that doesn't make any sense, because that honor is not in their control, and they can lose it without even doing anything. It's also not virtue. Virtue is not the chief end. What he says is, the chief end appears to be known by those who live the contemplative life. And this object of the contemplative life is going to be the true definition of felicity. And we're going to investigate this through the rest of this study. The third life is the contemplative life, which we shall make the object of our consideration hereafter. And let me just say, while we're on this topic of the contemplative life, that in modern circles, for most people, Christianity exists in a vacuum. You're either a sinner in the world or you're a Christian trying to be good. In many places, that's what our experience suggests to us, that the good people around us are Christians who fear God and seek to keep His commandments. And if you're not a Christian, it's because you're bad. You're an evil person. You're worldly, selfish, violent, and so on. And that's often the case. But we have to acknowledge that our experience doesn't really represent the truth. And in the time of, let's say, the apostles, when Jesus Christ lived himself, philosophy had created schools and raised men who were living a contemplative life, who were living a life set apart from, as we see, from the life of the vulgar, from the pursuit of pleasure, from the vain pursuit of honor among political men. Philosophy led men to understand that those things were not the true ends of human life and were not the true sources of happiness. There were men already living a contemplative life in the world before the time of Christ. Aristotle lived 350 years before Christ, and he was speaking of contemplative life and its benefits and superiority to all other kinds of life. And I want to point this out because modern students, they tend to believe that one chooses to either live out a religious vocation, which we often refer to as the contemplative life, a contemplative religious vocation focused on the study of divine revelation, sacred readings, the pursuit of holiness, and so on. We put that in the category of religious vocation. And the alternative to that is the two kinds of life that Aristotle mentions, the life of the vulgar and the life of the political. And so children being raised in Christian circles, in modern circles, tend to see that one either chooses to pursue a contemplative life in religious vocations or a vulgar or political life. And we see in Aristotle that that's not how we're to understand this decision about vocation. There is such a thing as a secular contemplative life. There is such a thing as a contemplative life that doesn't require that one enter into a religious community or go to seminary or take religious vows. there is another kind of life that's called a contemplative life, which is a secular kind of life, which was known to the philosophers in the ancient world. And that's why we can't allow students to get away with this excuse making for lives given to pleasure or vain pursuits of honor in the world. We can't allow them to say, no, I don't think God's calling me to a religious vocation, or I don't think God's calling me to the priesthood. Therefore, I'm free to live like cattle, to pursue the vulgar life, to pursue pleasure as the end of my life, or to pursue political honors, or as Aristotle goes on to mention another life, which is the pursuit of wealth. We can't allow Christian students to have this easy escape from a responsibility to pursue virtuous living, to pursue wisdom, to pursue sanctity and goodness, which is the pursuit of the contemplative life, just because they don't believe that they're not called to a religious vocation. Religious vocation is simply one kind of contemplative life. Contemplative living was already known and practiced by men in ancient Greece, the ancient philosophers, hundreds of years before the church was ever founded. So I hope that that's a point that's clear. That's a major problem in modern education, that children see themselves choosing between a life of contemplation in religious vocations and then a life given to pleasure or honor or money making in a secular vocation. We're obligated to pursue the contemplative life even if we choose a secular state of life. That's what Aristotle's getting at here. So the third kind of life is a contemplative life. He then goes on to say, the life, however, which is engaged in the acquisition of riches, of business, is a certain violent life. And it is evident that wealth is not the good for which we investigate. Wealth cannot possibly be the supreme good, for reasons that everyone already understands. He says wealth is useful for the sake of something else. Therefore, that other thing is actually superior to wealth, because wealth is only pursued for the sake of something else. Hence, the things which have been before mentioned may be considered as ends rather than wealth, for they are loved on their own account. It appears, however, that neither does felicity consist in these, though many arguments are adduced that prove it does. These things, therefore, we shall dismiss. So, Aristotle's conclusion to this question is that while different men define happiness differently based on their kind of life, the kind of life that's actually true on the subject is the contemplative life. And the good that they pursue is the good of wisdom and true happiness. That's the happiness that Jesus refers to in the Beatitudes, the happiness of the contemplative, wise, good man who seeks in life the chief end, the supreme good. And as Aristotle explains, seeks it not only for himself, but for the sake of everyone else. He loves his neighbor as himself. So you can see how this classical ethics and Christian moral teaching is all going to tie together and become a very helpful system for us, because while it's good for us to study divine revelation, and we receive divine revelation by faith, we trust God as its source, we trust sacred scripture as its source, and we believe and practice it because of the source. That's what faith is. Philosophy allows us to go deeper and get into the real reasons and details of why the moral philosophy that God has revealed through Christ and through the scriptures, why it is really true, why it is really the best and happiest life, why Christ's way, Christ's moral teaching really is in our best interest. It's not just because it's revealed by God, which is enough, but the reasons can also be provided. Experience will also confirm that it's true, that the way of the Christian life, true moral philosophy, pursuing the true and only supreme good of human life, is the only way. There's no alternative. It's not just an opinion. It's not just my beliefs, as some people wrongly say. It's not just our beliefs. The wise men, philosophers like Aristotle, they knew and could explain why the teaching that we'll find in the morals of the Catholic Church are in fact true and aimed at leading us to the supreme good, which is true happiness. So we'll see as we study classical ethics just how helpful it is in the Christian life. It presents Christ's moral teaching from a different perspective, from the perspective of human reason. And that becomes very helpful in helping us to not only believe the truth of divine revelation, but to understand it by reason. Remember, divine revelation was to help us, not just to reveal things that are impossible for us to know, but also to make it easier for us to know things that are possible for men to learn through reason. We see that these are the things that Aristotle was able to learn and articulate by the exercise of reason itself through philosophical studies and investigation. They were divinely revealed by Christ to all people to be received by faith. But we can now, having received them by faith, knowing them to be true by faith, we can now go back to the old philosophers, because in God's providence we have the opportunity and ability to do so. We can go back and now learn also the reasons by which these things can be known, not just by faith, but by reason as well. So get to work studying chapter 5 of book 1. It's a great chapter, very important. It was very important in the lives of my children as they were growing up, because reading Aristotle, they knew they didn't want to be classified as people living the vulgar life. My children chose military careers because they saw that as political life, and while they didn't have the virtue at the time, when they were entering into young adulthood, they didn't have the strength of character or the wisdom to choose a contemplative life, which is a very difficult life to choose. Remember, Aristotle says differing views of happiness are reasonable based on people's different conditions. While my children didn't have the virtue that it took to choose a contemplative life as they entered into young adulthood, they have chosen to avoid the worst of the lives, which is the vulgar life. And that's one way that Aristotle's ethics can help us. It can help us to see what's the worst and avoid it, and choose what's better, what's more elegant than the life of cattle. And that entrance into the political life, while it's to some degree satisfying, will eventually lead us to seek what's more satisfying, especially when we gain and lose honor and experience what Aristotle's talking about. And we'll begin to understand why the contemplative life and why the good pursued through the contemplative life is truly the only good that can ever satisfy us. Remember, St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And that resting in God is true happiness, which is found only in a contemplative life. So read chapter 5 for yourself, study it for mastery, and when you're comfortable with that, we'll continue our study in Aristotle's Ethics. God bless your studies.